There is nothing more dangerous than ignorance in action. When Goethe penned these words, he couldn't have known how prophetic they would become in the darkest hours of the 20th century. It's a warning that would find its most powerful interpreter in Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who witnessed firsthand how collective blindness could transform an entire nation. Bonhoeffer made a crucial distinction that modern psychology confirms. Evil and stupidity operate on fundamentally different principles. While evil typically knows it's doing wrong, stupidity marches forward with absolute conviction in its righteousness. This isn't about intelligence. Some of Nazi Germany's most educated minds surrendered their critical thinking most completely. It's about a psychological phenomenon Bonhoeffer witnessed, spreading through German society like a virus. The willingness to abandon individual judgment for the comfort of mass certainty. What gave Bonhoeffer's insights such devastating clarity was his position as both participant and observer. As a theologian inside Hitler's Germany, he watched in real time as reasonable people, professors, doctors, pastors, gradually accepted the unacceptable. He documented how this mental surrender happened, not through force, but through small incremental abdications of personal responsibility. The most dangerous aspect of mass conformity isn't its visibility, but its invisibility. It disguises itself as common sense, as patriotism, as pragmatism. It doesn't announce itself as moral collapse, but as reasonable adaptation to changing times. Bonhoeffer noted how those caught in this psychological trap don't experience themselves as complicit in evil. They feel normal, sensible, even virtuous in their conformity. In such environments, Bonhoeffer realized something that would later be confirmed by the Stanford Prison Experiment and Milgram's obedience studies. Critical thinking itself becomes an act of resistance. The simple act of asking why, when everyone else nods along, becomes not just an intellectual exercise, but a profound moral stance. To maintain one's capacity for independent judgment when the crowd rushes toward certainty requires not just intelligence, but courage. Section 1. Bonhoeffer's journey. Born into privilege, raised amid intellect, yet destined to challenge the darkest regime of the 20th century. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's early life gave no obvious hints of the moral giant he would become. The son of Karl Bonhoeffer, a distinguished psychiatrist, and Paula, from a lineage of theologians, young Dietrich absorbed both scientific rigor and spiritual depth at his family table. You can see the seeds of his later courage in the environment that shaped him. A household where questions were encouraged, where dinner conversations wrestled with the deepest issues of human existence. This wasn't just a comfortable upbringing, it was an apprenticeship in critical thinking. The death that changed everything came during World War I, when his brother Walter fell in battle. You might imagine a 13-year-old processing grief in many ways, but Dietrich's response was extraordinary. He turned toward theology, not as escape, but as confrontation with the ultimate questions of existence. They didn't understand, these adults around him, why a brilliant boy from a secular-leaning family would choose such a path. His father, the man of science, harbored hopes for a different career for his son. Yet something had awakened in Dietrich that would not be denied. A hunger to understand not just how the world works, but what gives it meaning. Theological training took him from Tübingen to Berlin to New York. But this wasn't merely academic pursuit. While his contemporaries debated theological abstractions, Bonhoeffer immersed himself in the practical reality of ministry. The Sunday school he taught, the youth group he led, these became laboratories for testing what faith meant in action. You can see a pattern forming, the intellectual and the practical merging in a man who refused to separate thought from action. His academic brilliance might have insulated him in ivory towers, but instead, he chose engagement with real people, real problems. The Nazi ascension in 1933 forced an immediate moral reckoning. While many German Christians found ways to accommodate Hitler's regime, Bonhoeffer recognized the fundamental incompatibility between authentic Christianity and National Socialism. His opposition wasn't gradual or hesitant, it was immediate and clear-eyed. They had created positive Christianity, a perversion of faith that baptized racial hatred in religious language. Bonhoeffer responded with the Church and the Jewish question, declaring the Church's obligation to oppose unjust governments, to aid victims of state persecution, regardless of their religion. You can see in this early stand the moral clarity that would define his resistance. The underground seminary at Finkenwald represented Bonhoeffer's most direct challenge to Nazi control of religious institutions. Imagine creating a secret community dedicated to authentic Christian formation, while the state demanded ideological conformity. They studied theology, yes, but also practiced what Bonhoeffer called life together, a radical community that embodied the alternative to the Nazi worldview. You might think of it as not just educational resistance, but psychological resistance, creating a space where different values could be lived and breathed when the surrounding culture had become toxic. His decision to join active resistance through the Abwehr, military intelligence, marked Bonhoeffer's most controversial step. The theologian became conspirator, using his international connections to help Jews escape, and ultimately supporting plots to assassinate Hitler. The moral calculations behind this choice reveal Bonhoeffer's psychological complexity. You can see him wrestling with fundamental questions. Is violence ever justified to prevent greater violence? Does responsibility sometimes require compromising one's own moral purity? They arrested him in April 1943, not fully aware of the extent of his resistance activities. Prison transformed the theologian into his most profound self. The letters he wrote from Tegel prison reveal a man engaged in deep existential reflection, even as external freedoms were stripped away. His concept of religionless Christianity emerged not in comfortable academic settings, but in the crucible of confinement. You might expect bitterness or despair, but instead, these writings pulse with an almost transcendent clarity. They watched him, guards and fellow prisoners alike, offering comfort to others despite his own situation, embodying what he had long preached about finding freedom within constraints. The final days at Flossenbürg concentration camp showcased the culmination of Bonhoeffer's journey. Conducting a final service for fellow prisoners, knowing execution was imminent, he chose a text about the renewal that comes through suffering. His reported last words, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life," reflect not just religious faith but psychological integration. You can see in this final act the man fully realized the seamless connection between his theology and his lived reality. They hanged him on April 9, 1945, just 2 weeks before Allied forces liberated the camp, a timing that underscores the tragedy of his death. His legacy transcends theology to speak directly to our psychological understanding of moral courage. Bonhoeffer demonstrates what psychologists now recognize, that resistance to authoritarian systems requires not just intellectual disagreement, but a fully integrated moral identity. You find in his writings and actions a model of what psychologist Robert Kegan would later call self-authorship, the capacity to maintain internal values when external pressures demand conformity. They might have silenced his voice, but his example continues to illuminate one of humanity's most persistent questions. How do we maintain our humanity when systems around us have lost theirs? But to truly understand Bonhoeffer's impact, we must explore his most powerful insight, the psychological mechanism that makes ordinary people surrender their critical thinking to destructive forces. Section 2. The theory of stupidity. Stupidity's true nature remained hidden until Bonhoeffer exposed its psychological mechanics. During his imprisonment, observing both guards and fellow prisoners, he reached a revolutionary insight. Stupidity isn't a cognitive deficiency, but a moral surrender. This isn't about IQ or education. Some of his most intellectually brilliant contemporaries had become the most unthinking supporters of Nazism. Instead, Bonhoeffer recognized stupidity as a psychological defense mechanism, a willful abandonment of critical thinking to avoid the burden of moral responsibility. You see this mechanism at work whenever complex ethical challenges are reduced to simplistic slogans, whenever difficult questions are answered with, "Everyone knows this is true." They create specific conditions to cultivate mass stupidity. Authoritarian systems understand instinctively that independent thinking threatens their control, so they deliberately foster environments where conformity feels safer than questioning. Watch how such systems operate. They don't begin by demanding allegiance to obviously immoral positions. They start by normalizing small surrenders of judgment. First, you accept a minor distortion to avoid conflict. Then another. Then another. Before you recognize what's happening, you've trained yourself to suppress your own critical faculties. The unholy trinity of fear, conformity, and moral abdication creates stupidity's perfect storm. Your natural human desire for security makes you vulnerable to manipulation. When authorities link safety with compliance, when social acceptance depends on embracing group thinking, the psychological cost of resistance becomes increasingly prohibitive. Bonhoeffer observed how this mechanism operated in Nazi Germany. The fear wasn't always of direct punishment, but of standing alone, of being the one person asking questions when everyone else had accepted the answers provided. Group dynamics transform reasonable individuals into unreasoning collectives through well-established psychological mechanisms. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments, conducted years after Bonhoeffer's death, would scientifically confirm what the theologian had observed. Most people will deny obvious truth when surrounded by others doing the same. They become different beings in groups, surrendering their individual judgment to collective identity. Bonhoeffer's genius was recognizing that this transformation isn't just a social phenomenon, but a moral one. Each surrender of personal judgment is also a surrender of personal responsibility. What makes mass stupidity more dangerous than malice is its psychological invisibility to those affected. The malicious person typically knows they're doing wrong. The stupid person feels completely justified, even virtuous. You can reason with malice, appeal to self-interest, or create consequences that deter it. But stupidity armors itself against correction. Bonhoeffer watched educated people dismiss obvious facts that contradicted their adopted worldview, not because they couldn't understand the evidence, but because they had surrendered their right to independent evaluation. This is why education alone fails to solve the problem. You can fill minds with knowledge without teaching them how to think critically about what they know. But if stupidity is such a powerful force, so resistant to intervention, how do we break its grip? Bonhoeffer's answer reveals a path not just to intellectual freedom, but to moral courage. Section 3. Intellectual autonomy. The prison walls surrounding Bonhoeffer revealed a profound paradox about freedom. Though physically confined, he discovered a deeper liberty that his guards, despite their physical freedom, had surrendered. This distinction between external and internal freedom became central to his understanding of resistance. External freedom, the ability to move and act without constraint, means little if your mind remains imprisoned by unquestioned dogma. Conversely, internal freedom, the capacity to think independently despite external pressures, represents humanity's most fundamental liberty. You might possess every physical comfort and social privilege while remaining intellectually imprisoned, or you might, like Bonhoeffer in his cell, maintain profound mental freedom despite external constraints. Developing moral responsibility in an immoral society requires a psychological strength that few discuss, but everyone needs. They want you comfortable, not challenging, consuming, not questioning, fitting in, not standing out. The systems around you, whether political, commercial, or social, benefit from your unthinking compliance. Bonhoeffer recognized that breaking free from this requires what psychologists now call internal locus of control, the deep conviction that your moral choices remain your responsibility, regardless of external circumstances. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's practical psychology. Each time you defer to authority without questioning, each time you accept everyone does it as justification, you weaken this internal muscle. Each time you ask, is this right? When everyone else is asking, is this popular? You strengthen it. The price of intellectual autonomy is guaranteed discomfort. Your mind naturally seeks alignment with your social group. We evolved as tribal creatures, and our brains reward us with belonging and punish us with isolation. Standing apart creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental distress that comes from holding positions different from your community. They make this discomfort nearly unbearable through subtle and not so subtle forms of exclusion. Bonhoeffer understood that overcoming this requires more than intelligence. It demands courage, the willingness to bear psychological pain for the sake of truth. This courage isn't a personality trait you either have or don't. It's a capacity you develop through practice, strengthening with each small choice to think for yourself. The practical path toward intellectual autonomy begins with specific mental habits that Bonhoeffer both taught and modeled. Start by questioning not just what you think, but how you came to think it. Examine the sources of your convictions. Did you reach them through careful consideration, or did you absorb them from your environment? You strengthen your intellectual independence by deliberately seeking perspectives that challenge your existing views. This isn't about being contrarian. It's about developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility. The ability to consider multiple viewpoints without being captured by any of them. Bonhoeffer demonstrated this by engaging deeply with opposing perspectives, understanding them from within, before forming his own judgments. Learning to recognize mass manipulation requires understanding its psychological mechanisms. Watch for emotional contagion, how feelings spread through groups, overwhelming individual judgment. Notice false dichotomies that eliminate nuance and force false choices. Pay attention to your own emotional reactions. Strong feelings often signal that someone is manipulating rather than informing you. They've perfected these techniques over centuries, but Bonhoeffer would remind us that awareness of the process is the first step toward immunity from it. The ultimate goal isn't perfect resistance to every influence, but what he called living in truth, maintaining alignment between your internal values and your external actions, reclaiming human dignity by exercising the distinctly human capacity to think and choose for yourself. What if the most radical act of courage in today's world isn't physical bravery, but simply the willingness to think for yourself when everyone around you has surrendered that right?